to share information with community members and outside community members. So thank you again for being here. And we're gonna do a quick poll before getting started. So I'm gonna go ahead and launch it. We just wanna know our audience and just know where everyone is at with the term CSEC. So I'm gonna go ahead and launch the poll. And I'll give everyone a few seconds to answer it. Alrighty, we had almost everyone answer. So we are going to go ahead
Someone's asking if we could send it again. It looks like in the chat. I don't know if it would restart it, but just wanted to give everybody a chance to answer.
Okay. So we are going to relaunch it. Just so everybody has an opportunity to answer. Alrighty. And thank you everyone that's taking their time to go ahead and answer. Alrighty, so we have almost everyone answer. So just in the interest of time and so we can get the most out of this presentation, I'm gonna go ahead and close the poll now. Alrighty, so can everyone see the results here? Yes? Alrighty, so it looks like mostly everybody knows what CSEC stands for and they know some information. We have a few who know a little bit about it, few who are unsure, so it's a good mix. So before we continue on, I do want to remind everyone to please go ahead and if you have any questions, type them in the chat. We'll try our best to answer right when you ask the question, but if not, at the end, we will be answering all questions. Alrighty, so to start off, the definition for CSEC that we are using is from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. And CSEC itself stands for Commercial Sexual Exploitation of Children. And the definition itself is, it refers to a range of crimes and activities involving the sexual abuse or exploitation of a child for the financial benefit of any person or in exchange for anything of value, including monetary and non-monetary benefits, given or received by any person. So what I want to point out here that I believe is very important for us to understand is that a lot of times non-monetary benefits can look like basic living needs that a child or a teen might need, which could be shelter, protection, food, safety, anything like that. So here's a few examples of how CSEC can look like. First one being child sex trafficking, or in other words, known as the prostitution of children. It can also look like child sex tourism involving commercial sexual activity. It can also be child pornography, which includes online videos, images, things like so. And there's also situations where a child, whether or not at the direction of any other person, engages in any type of sexual activity in exchange for anything of value. And again, it includes non-monetary things such as food, shelter, protection, safety, and in some cases when the child or the teenager does have a drug addiction, also in exchange for drugs. And also I want to point out here that the child sex tourism can look like when somebody travels from, let's say, the US to a different country and pays to have sex with the child over there. That's what child sex tourism is, and that's a different way that CSEC can look like.
So we want to get into some myths about CSEC, in particular because, you know, it's important to kind of do some myth busting before we can really get into the actual, like, you know, what is CSEC, or how do we support CSEC survivors? What are the dynamics of CSEC? And so it's important to know that CSEC is a form of trafficking, like Dahlia said. So here, you know, we're going to use CSEC and trafficking interchangeably in this slide. So one of the big ones is that trafficking or CSEC must involve a form of travel, transportation, or movement across national and state lines. That's a big one people assume, because when we hear trafficking, we think of like drug trafficking, which usually is like going from state lines or going from, you know, across countries. But human trafficking does not necessarily need the movement, and CSEC doesn't need movement in order to be CSEC. One of the things we know is that in some instances, there is movement. We know, unfortunately, that up and down our state, we're in California, up and down our state, you know, two of the big kind of routes we see for CSEC survivors are up the 101 and up Highway 5 or Interstate 5. We see that a lot as trafficking routes. But also, people can be trafficked in one location. They might be trafficked out of one house for, you know, many years. They might be, you know, trafficked around one little neighborhood or one part of the state. So trafficking doesn't have to involve transportation. It can, but that's not a requisite of it to be identified as CSEC or trafficking. Another one, and this is really common for what we used to call survival sex, or as Dahlia said, like, you know, child prostitution, which we no longer call it that. Now we call it CSEC. Oh, I think we moved the slide. Oh, there we go. Awesome. So one of them is that CSEC survivors made a choice. That is completely false. So a lot of the times when we would hear words like child prostitute or, you know, things like that, or survival sex, we are assuming that the person, the child in the situation, made a choice to be involved in this life, which that is completely not the case. So with things like survival sex, where, you know, a child maybe was having sex for money or was having sex for a place to stay or food or shelter, things like that, that is still exploitation. You know, the way we can kind of think of it is there was an adult here who had a room, had some food, had some clothing, and instead of helping this child out, giving them food, shelter, connecting them with resources, they exploited their vulnerability of needing these things by getting sex from them and saying, oh, I'm helping you out. That's not helping the child out. And so we never want to, you know, kind of fall into the, oh, this person made a choice, because the choices were taken from them through means of poverty, or you know, by not having access to shelter, not having access to clothing. So really kind of reframing how we think of that, which is part of why we now say CSEC and not survival sex or child prostitution, because we really want to highlight the victimhood and the vulnerability of these survivors. Another one is that physical force or physical restraint must be present for the identification of CSEC or trafficking. That is completely false as well. So oftentimes we think of, you know, somebody who's chained up, somebody who, you know, is like locked in a basement. So like all these kind of like things that the media images kind of portray as trafficking or as CSEC, but that's not always the case. And we're going to talk a lot about why physical force or physical restraint doesn't have to be present for somebody to be a CSEC survivor. Another big one is that trafficking only occurs in illegal or underground industries. So one thing we know is that you can have somebody who is a CSEC survivor in what we would have known as a, you know, legitimate business. Maybe it's a business that, you know, and one that comes up often is, unfortunately, children who are forced into pornography. legitimate pornography is a non-illegal business, but this can happen in even legitimate businesses. Another one that can happen is modeling agencies, things like that, where they are legitimate businesses, but trafficking and CSEC can happen in those just as frequently as they do in like illegal illicit businesses, like gang activity and things like that. Another big one, only certain kinds of individuals get trafficked or are traffickers. So oftentimes when we think of CSEC, we are thinking of girls as the victims. And that completely ignores the fact that boys are also likely to be CSEC victims, as are transgender youth. So CSEC can affect all folks, and we live in a very a society that looks at certain people as good and certain people as bad. And oftentimes when you look at the images of CSEC on like Google and things like that, usually the victims are white or light skin. And if you like Google traffickers, usually they're brown and men. And we really need to highlight the embedded racism and sexism of that. And that CSEC survivors can come from any race, any gender, any ethnicity. But we will talk about certain vulnerabilities that some people may have to being CSEC survivors over others. And then another big one is that trafficking or CSEC survivors will immediately ask for help and identify as victims of a crime. This is a very complex issue, and it goes into the idea of CSEC survivors made a choice when we don't fully understand why a CSEC survivor may not readily, if police bust down the door and they're like, I'm taking you out of here, why they may not readily say, yes, I'm so glad, I feel safe, I feel like, I want to go with you. And why a lot of the times trafficking survivors may push back when law enforcement gets involved. And it has to do a lot with what's called grooming, which we're going to get into in a later slide. So how often does this happen? That's an important thing to kind of consider. And so there's a lot of different data out there, but the biggest thing is that limited data exists. At one point, it was being estimated that 100,000 children were involved in human trafficking in the United States. That number has since been rolled back, but you're going to hear that number a lot. It's something that comes up often where people, are quoting the study. But I have an asterisk there because even the person who made the study has now come out and said, oh, that number was actually not really accurate. That number was looking more at how many children are vulnerable to trafficking and to CSEC. So we really want to be aware that if you hear that 100,000 children number, your ears kind of want to perk up that is not necessarily the true or correct data. In California, there was a human trafficking task force that looked at identified CSEC youth over a 2-year period from 2014 to 2016, and identified 1,200 CSEC youth who were identified as trafficking survivors in the state. But one of the things we know is that even that data is not fully complete. So the truth of the matter is very limited data on CSEC exists. In part, that is because, so in that 2014 to 2016, it was 2016, in fact, where CSEC victims in California, or CSEC survivors in California, became classified in our laws as victims. So prior to 2016, if a child, somebody under the age of 18, was caught prostituting, they were arrested as a prostitute. Terrible. There was no level of this person is a victim of a crime and we need to protect them. It was all based on, these old antiquated prostitution laws that actually wound up harming survivors of CSEC. So we know that those numbers are a lot, like those numbers don't reflect the true picture. And we also know that a lot of CSEC survivors were going unidentified because of those situations of limited data. What we can tell you is here at Monarch, we serve about 30 to 40 trafficking survivors annually, with about 10 to 15 of those trafficking survivors being youth under the age of 18. And so grooming. So this is a really important topic that I think is kind of like one of the crux of why CSEC survivors may not say like, oh, I'm a victim of a crime, may not readily identify as a victim of a crime. It's also one of the reasons why physical force and physical restraint aren't required in order for somebody to be a CSEC survivor. So grooming is a really slow process, or it can be a slow process. Oftentimes when we hear about, these things in popular media, we are hearing about this idea of, oh, this person was kidnapped off the street, thrown into a prostitution situation or into a CSEC situation, and then someone's going to save them. They're going to readily identify as a victim, and that's rare. I won't say it doesn't happen, but that is exceptionally rare. What usually happens is more of this process. And so grooming starts with the targeting of the victim. So targeting of the person who's going to be trafficked, who's going to be involved in CSEC. This targeting of the victim, we've heard, we do a lot of curriculums based on prevention of CSEC. And one of the things we've heard from former traffickers is that they would be able to walk into a room and within a minute or two identify which kid they're going to target. And that is for a host of reasons. Maybe that child's body language, maybe the way that child is interacting with other children. All of those things can help somebody target a victim. One of the big ones we know is targeting a victim can happen when a youth has run away from home, run away from their foster home. They're out on the street at 2, 3 a.m. That's prime picking for a trafficker to understand, oh, this is a victim that I can target. Next is gaining information and gaining trust. And that's a real key here, is the trafficker rarely just says, hey, I'm going to kidnap you, I'm going to throw you out on the street. Instead, it's usually a slow progression of gaining trust. And it can look like, maybe that happens in a week, maybe that happens we've heard over the course of a year, where someone is now gaining your trust. Why are you on the street? I can help you. What's your family like? Gaining trust and information that they can later exploit. This is also important to note that sometimes traffickers will pose as a romantic interest of the CSEC survivor. We see that quite frequently. I see a question here. I'm going to just finish this one part of the gaining trust and information, and then I'll answer your question. But so we see that they'll often pose as a boyfriend or a girlfriend, because remember, traffickers can have any gender, and they will, have the youth thinking, oh, this is my boyfriend, this is my girlfriend, but I have to keep it secret because they're older, they're an adult, and that way the trafficker is is gaining their trust, that they think that I'm in a relationship with this person, that this person loves me. Another one we'll hear frequently is traffickers will say things like, oh, you are so much older than your friends, or your parents are treating you like you're a baby, kind of like gassing them up, making them feel like, oh, other people don't understand, I'm so mature, I'm so worldly, when really it's an exploitation tactic. And I do want to pause there because I saw somebody's hand go up, and see if there was a question before we continue with the grooming stages. Yep. Okay, so then after the aspect of gaining trust comes filling a need. This is really, really important, because what will happen is, so let's say in that gaining trust and information, the trafficker finds out that, oh, you've never felt loved by anybody in your family. They'll fill that need. They'll make the person feel loved, feel validated. Maybe they found out that the person was, living in extreme poverty their whole life. They'll fill that need. They'll buy them nice things, nice clothes, purses, get the nails done, hair done, all the things. Maybe they find out that they are, addicted to some kind of substance. The trafficker will provide that. They'll fill the need of giving them the substance. And so now at this point, the youth is thinking, I've got either a new friend or a new boyfriend or girlfriend. They're, making me feel loved, or they're providing me money. They're, taking me on trips. They're doing all this fun stuff. And they're in complete trust of this person. It's not feeling like, oh, this is a dangerous situation. It's feeling like, oh, I'm getting my needs met. And then what comes after that is the isolation. So this is key for any form of abuse. I think it's really important to understand that isolation is really at the crux of CSEC, trafficking, domestic violence, all kinds of abuse. And so the isolation can look like actual physical isolation, moving the person away from their family and friends, or it can look like emotional isolation. Maybe they guilt their survivor or their victim anytime they go hang out with a friend, or they start to do more and more to keep them away from school, keep them away from work, or whatever the case may be. And after that isolation has occurred, the abuse can begin. And so at this point, you know, they've maybe been with this person hanging out for a long time. And think about ourselves as adults. If we as an adult were hanging out with somebody for, let's say, 6 months, and in 6 months we thought they were our friend or our partner, they were making us feel loved, making us feel trusted. If abuse began, we as adults would be very confused. What's happening? How did we get here? So children are even more confused, particularly if those children have had, and we'll talk more about the vulnerabilities, have had a history of being abused in the past. Like, wait, what's happening here? How did we get here? And after the abuse begins, then the maintaining of control. So it may be that now, you know, the abuse has begun, and now the person who's the trafficker may not need to threaten to hit them, or, you know, may not need to physically restrain them because of the situation of grooming. The person might feel like, well, they're my boyfriend and I want to do what they want me to do. They're my best friend and I want them to, you know, be happy. I want them to, you know, be happy with me. And so the maintaining control really happens after a series of grooming tactics that have brought the survivor to this point. And I want to pause there for any grooming questions. Let's check the chat. Okay, so trauma bonding. So this is really important to understand what trauma bonding is and how it works. So trauma bonding explains the phenomenon of survivors developing emotional attachment to their abusers, exploiters, traffickers, and we see this in a whole host of situations. So it's not just CSEC, but we see this in hostage situations, cults. It used to be what's called Stockholm Syndrome, but we know more the understanding of the mechanisms of it, so we no longer call it that. And the next slide will go into more about how it works. So how does this work? So trauma bonding occurs as a result of ongoing cycles of abuse where intermittent reinforcement of rewards and punishment create powerful emotional bonds. So one of the things to know is it's kind of like a cycle. So the first part of the cycle is what people have called like the love bomb, where the person you met, the abuser or the trafficker, showers you with love and affection. So just like I talked about in that grooming cycle, they're filling the need. So the first phase starts with filling of the need. You are starting to be very bonded with this person, starting to really trust this person. Then comes like a level of maybe honeymoon or dependency, where the trafficker creates a situation where you feel heavily dependent on them for that love and validation. They might say things like, I'm the only one who's ever loved you. I'm the only one who's gonna love you in this way that you need. And it creates kind of a dependency for the survivor. Then the abuse and the devaluation happen. So after you've already kind of depended on this person for your love, for the feelings of validation, they'll start to abuse you. They'll start to sell you to Johns, put you out on the street, things like that. And this basically can include everything from threats to, do worse abuse, to just the general abuse of forcing a child to sell sex. And then what'll happen is the gaslighting will occur. At that point, maybe the survivor is having a horrible time with this. They're struggling, they're crying, they're having all of these big emotions, and the trafficker will say things like, well, this wouldn't be so bad if you just stopped crying, or, I could reward you. I wouldn't have to hit you. I wouldn't have to do all these horrible things to you if you would just do what I say. And then it goes into the cycle of, okay, now the survivor is getting the understanding of, well, if I just do what they say, things will be calm, they'll treat me good again. And it becomes a cyclical pattern, just like any other kind of abuse, where our brains cannot differentiate the fact that the person who's making us feel good after all this horrible abuse is the same person who put us in the abusive situation in the first place. It is an incredibly powerful bond, and it is one of the reasons why a lot of survivors won't say, hey, I'm a victim right now, because they're so bonded to this person who's caused them all this harm. It's also part of why, we've worked with law enforcement in the past, and they can be very frustrated when they go in to save these survivors, and the survivors are like pushing back against them, yelling at them, treating them like they're the issue. But a large part of that is because the survivor is so worried about what the trafficker will think, or how the trafficker will feel, or how they'll react, that they are more concerned with keeping the trafficker happy than they are with getting out of this abusive situation. And so vulnerabilities to CSEC. So we alluded to some of these, but it's important to kind of know that while we know anybody can be a survivor of CSEC, we also know that certain vulnerabilities are things that traffickers prey upon. And the biggest one, well, there's a lot here, but one of the biggest ones is past trauma exposure. So past domestic violence, past sexual assault, past neglect. And so in that grooming stage I was talking about of gaining trust and information, this is usually where the trafficker will get that kind of information from the survivor. So they might, tell the survivor they themselves were abused. They might, tell the survivor, oh, nobody should treat you like how your uncle who touched you treated you. Nobody should treat you like your mom who invalidated your abuse. And so one of those things that they'll do is kind of use that past trauma exposure to gain trust, while also knowing that this is a youth whose vulnerabilities have already been violated in many ways. And so because of that, they know that they can likely violate the youth's vulnerabilities in other ways, that this youth might not have very firm boundaries, might not know what boundaries even are because they have been so disrespected from an early age. The next big vulnerability is LGBTQ plus identity status. And I want to make perfectly clear that being LGBTQ is not the vulnerability. Like, being gay, being, queer, being lesbian, trans, all those things, that is not the vulnerability. The vulnerability is living in a homophobic, transphobic society, where we know that the majority of, or disproportionately, the majority of youth who are out on the streets homeless are LGBTQ youth. And they're often put out on the streets by parents who decided not to love their children because of their identity status. So those youth are particularly vulnerable because a trafficker might be the first person to tell a trans youth, I value you as a trans person. And how powerful would that be if nobody else in your life has ever said that you have worth because of your gender identity? Same with, lesbian, gay, bisexual, all those different identities, is that traffickers know the terminology. They're very learned in making sure they use the right pronouns, the right phrases, the right words, and they might be the first person to tell this youth that they value them as their identity. And these youth are also more likely to be on the streets because of the homophobic, transphobic society we live in. So this one's a really easy one to kind of mitigate the vulnerability to. We need to make sure that our LGBTQ youth are affirmed, that they feel accepted, and not just like what we used to call like, tolerance. Who wants to be tolerated? If someone's telling you I tolerate you, it's really not great. We want to affirm their right to exist, their right to love as they want, their right to be who they want. That is one of the easiest vulnerabilities we can stop today. Like, we can address this so quickly if we change the way our society relates to LGBTQ youth. Another big one is isolated individuals. It might be that they're isolated from past abuse. They might be physically isolated, emotionally isolated for various reasons, and traffickers can really prey on that, making them feel, wanted, making them feel included. Another big one, foster youth. Usually if somebody is in the foster system, some not so great things happen in their family of origin. And so traffickers will kind of use that as an entry point and a vulnerability point. And we also know some foster youth may have a tendency to run away from their foster homes for various reasons. And so being out on the street at night can be a huge flag to a trafficker that, oh, this is somebody that I can exploit, and this is somebody that I could traffic. Poverty is another huge one. So we do these presentations and, people are always like, how do I fight trafficking? But nobody ever wants to tie the fact that so much poverty is related to trafficking. And if we are really going to address these issues, we have to address them on a systemic level, including addressing poverty, because a lot of children who might beyond the street might be there because they didn't have a safe home to be at. They are, needing money, they're needing food, that survival sex like we talked about. And so poverty is a huge one. Immigration status, also another big one. We know that, we for the last 4 years, we've had an administration that was demonizing immigrants left and right in a really toxic, horrible way. So immigration status can be another vulnerability, particularly if that person is undocumented and doesn't have an ability to work. A trafficker might be like, oh, I have a way for you to work. And also, when we think of survivors, we don't always think of the most vulnerable being people who are undocumented. False hopes and promises. This is a big one. We all have vulnerabilities. There's all some pipe dream that we wanted for ourselves. Kids are no different. A big one that traffickers will say is, I can make you a model, I can make you an actor, I can make you famous. And that's so huge for a lot of youth. And we've even seen traffickers who did have modeling agencies. They were also trafficking those models. So on one end, these people were, these survivors were getting the career they thought they wanted. On the other end, while they were doing that, they were also being trafficked. Addictions, another big one. And so if somebody has an addiction, it's that much easier to exploit them. The traffickers will say, I will supply you with all the drugs you want, but you have to do this. And then disabilities. And disabilities, for similar reasons as LGBTQ, we live in a pretty ableist society where people with disabilities aren't often given opportunities to make money, and they're often not given opportunities to feel sexually affirmed. And a trafficker might completely, like try to be like, hey, I have money for you. I have, a place where you can kind of feel more affirmed in that way. And so we want to make sure that similarly that our youth with disabilities know that they are valued and have opportunities for themselves so traffickers cannot prey on them.
Okay, thank you, Sydney. And now we're going to identify red flags for CSEC. So how can we identify if someone that we are educating, if we're educators, someone that we're serving might be exposed to, again, being trafficked? These are just some of the common red flags. As we know, there are various red flags. And one of them is expensive items such as purses, clothing, so luxury items. Multiple cell phones. So if we see that this youth has multiple cell phones, doesn't feel comfortable sharing where these items or luxury items came from, and then of course excessive cash as well. Multiple reproductive health problems, STIs. This is specifically if a youth is constantly going to medical facilities seeking health care, or having reproductive health problems. That's another sign and a red flag. I also want to point out that while these are red flags that we might see, there is more to CSEC. So it is important that we're assessing the situation in order for us to be able to serve and provide support to these survivors. Definitely missing school regularly, so attendance for various reasons or not having a reason, malnutrition. Sydney also talked about the fact that poverty and how that can impact malnutrition, not having food at their home, not being able to feed themselves at schools, whatever that might be. But malnutrition is one of the definitely main red flags that we're often seeing. As Sydney also mentioned earlier, one of the vulnerabilities, and we see that youth are consuming alcohol or drug use, mental health problems. We might see signs of emotional distress, PTSD, which is a huge one due to the trauma that they have experienced or are experiencing, depression, anxiety, and of course paranoia as well. It is important to note that youth will significantly have either older friends, older boyfriends or girlfriends, or just older partners. So identifying that is important. Also, there are different language that you will hear from youth that they use. Daddy. Daddy is the term used for the male trafficker or the pimp per se. And then also bottom. Bottom is really that person that is appointed to approach and recruit youth for this type of system. They are also the individuals that sometimes not only help traffickers, but they also help punish the youth who are being trafficked. And then the life, really that is the life, using the jargon that many of the youth will be using. And then youth or child with high knowledge of sexual behavior as well. So, just pointing out, looking at these red flags, these are just some of the many red flags that we're able to see, and getting the help for these youth as much as possible. I see that there's a question. Exactly, or even the name auntie. There are various terms that you will hear that are not common. If I was to ask right now and ask, does anyone know what bottom is? I personally have not heard bottom often unless it is from a survivor who is being trafficked. So again, it is important for us to be mindful of these red flags as we are serving and trying to protect youth. Similar to what we talked about earlier, what do these images tell us, right? These images are reinforcing the myth of human trafficking. Now, if we were to go into Google right now and search trafficking, CSEC, these are the images that you would see. These are the images that we see in social media, that we see in the media, that we see in posters. However, this is really not this happens, and it is also possible, but really what we're missing is those individuals that don't have these signs, that not for sale signs, that are not tied. So again, it is important for us to know that CSEC and human trafficking is more to these images. Okay, really is invisible at times. So we wanted to point that out because it is extremely important, that while these images ignites frustration and anger, the person sitting next to you, that child that we're educating, that child that we're serving, could be a victim of CSEC. I now want to point out the services or the response that it's in Santa Cruz County. As we mentioned earlier, Monarch Services has offices in Santa Cruz and Watsonville, and we also have a confidential shelter. Our services are very comprehensive for all survivors, not only of human trafficking, CSEC, sexual violence, and domestic violence. One of our programs that we have is the Sky Center, where it's a center that has been created for survivors who are being interviewed in a trauma-informed manner. And Monarch Services participates in ensuring that we are part of these interviews for the well-being of the children. We also have our sexual assault response team that recently returned to Santa Cruz County at Dominican Hospital. We have a team that includes law enforcement, Monarch Services advocates who are always present to ensure, again, that we respond to the needs of the survivor. The team or the SARTs are composed of adults and pediatrics, where if a child of CSEC or any child has been sexually assaulted, we're able to respond to their needs. We also provide law enforcement trainings. It is essential for us in our community to ensure that not only law enforcement, but also just our community as a whole knows the importance of CSEC and the response, right? What can we do if we come across a situation of a child who's being trafficked? And so we have provided trainings to Santa Cruz Police Department, Watsonville Police Department, Santa Cruz County Sheriffs, and of course, all of the other jurisdictions as well. In addition, our response also includes the CSEC multidisciplinary team, which includes, similar to the SART team, it includes child welfare, county mental health, probation, law enforcement, and Monarch Services as well, Survivors Mentor. When when CSEC multidisciplinary team is activated, Monarch will respond to ensure that we're providing that service and that support to the survivor. And I see that there's questions, so I'm going to pause and answer some of these questions.
There was somebody had lost sound, so they were asking if that happened to anyone else.
Okay.
I think everyone's sound is good. I think that person was just having issues with the sound.
And we're happy to answer any questions toward the end or clarify anything that might have not been heard. Now, these are some of our services. So here we're just focusing on services for youth. However, Monarch Services, as I mentioned, we are very comprehensive in the services that we provide. First of all of our services are free, confidential, bilingual, and any survivor of not only CSEC or human trafficking is able to access these services. But for CSEC survivors, we do provide in-person advocacy, not only one-on-one services in our office or in a safe location, but also we respond. We have more than 30 advocates who are on our 24-hour on-call schedule to provide support to law enforcement interviews and during the sexual assault examinations, as mentioned earlier. In addition, our advocates will also respond to schools to provide that immediate in-person advocacy and support if needed. We also have our children and youth program that works very effectively and proactively with youth in providing not only support groups out of our facilities, support groups out of schools. Currently, because of the pandemic, we are doing things a little bit differently and are doing it virtually. And then we also have our CSEC prevention curriculum. Our prevention program focuses on doing what we're doing today, which is putting together not only webinars, but also education for schools, community on various topics. And one of our main topics is always CSEC. We want to make sure that our community is aware about the fact that CSEC exists and it's in our community. And we need to be able to identify it and be able to support. And so therefore, our prevention program will provide curriculum education on CSEC if needed. In addition, also, we have our 24-hour crisis line. Our 24-hour crisis line has, again, more than 30 advocates who are available to provide support, not only to adults, but also CSEC survivors, youth, anyone who has a question is able to call, and we're able to not only direct them, but safety plan. Safety planning is one of our essential support that we want to make sure that we're providing to that caller. In addition, while it's not here, but I wanted to mention that we also have a confidential shelter. Our confidential shelter provides services to CSEC survivors as well, and as long as we develop a plan along with the CSEC team. In addition, we want to make sure that we are providing transitional youth that opportunity to be safe as well. And so these are just some of our many programs and services that we provide at Monarch. And now we're going to go ahead and leave for questions for all of you. I'm going to go ahead and open it up, and I see that we might have some questions here.
I just want to add on the chat, I'm going to add the hotline, the national hotline for human trafficking, just in case somebody that's not in our county or in our state, they can have that. But yeah, we do have 2 questions. Want me to read them all? The first one we have is, do you know if CSEC has increased or decreased during social distancing?
That's a great question. And so I'm going to apologize now. My internet is being a little glitchy, so if I cut out, my apologies. But so as of right now, we just don't know. We just don't have enough information. That's kind of the hard part about CSEC is, and that we're in the, we're dealing with social distancing right now. Usually the research on CSEC happens a few, we get the numbers a few years after it actually is being researched. But what we know in our agency is that we have not seen an increase in CSEC survivors this last year. So since, gosh, we've been doing this almost for a year, since March of 2020 to today, and we've actually seen our CSEC numbers personally go down by just about maybe 3 or 4 clients, where, as I said before, we'll see maybe 10 to 15 trafficking or youth survivors of trafficking. This year we've seen a few less, but that could also be because there's, kind of a lack of being able to visibly see them because we're all in our houses, things like that. There might be less tips coming in. But as of right now, we just don't know. We have also experienced less trafficking survivors coming through our CSEC MDT, so our multidisciplinary team. We haven't seen as many as we have in previous years. One of the big things to know about Santa Cruz and CSEC is oftentimes the place you'll see CSEC happening the most is around kind of our more touristy districts of the downtown beach boardwalk kind of area. We tend to see more like labor trafficking in the Pajaro Valley area. And so tourism is down. So it is potentially that you could correlate CSEC potentially being down, but as of right now, we just don't know. But that's a great question.
All right, thank you. The next one we have is, have you had issues with bottom CSEC victims recruiting other vulnerable youth?
Yes. Oh, do you want to answer that one, Maria?
Oh, you can go ahead and answer it.
For sure. So yes, we have, in part because one of the things we know is, like, let's say the trafficker is a 30-year-old woman or 30-year-old man or whatever, they're going to look a little weird walking around a high school talking to the kids. That's going to be a red flag. So oftentimes the younger, like more bottoms or folks who've already been groomed might do the recruitment for the trafficker. And it also creates a situation where that person who's doing the recruitment might be rewarded by the trafficker. So they might, have less harsh punishments, or they might be treated better if they go out and do the recruitment. So we do see that occurring.
Righty, great questions. The next one is, why has the national data taken so long to gather and publish?
That's a great question. And it really just comes down to, just like any data, it takes a little while to publish, because most of the data that gets put out is either gone through like the National Human Trafficking Hotline, which if you go on their website, I don't know if Dahlia, if you can pop that in the chat, but if you go on their website, they have a lot of really great statistics around trafficking and CSEC survivors. But with like any data, it takes a little while for that to get published, to get peer reviewed. It also is, kind of trying to protect the fact that these are youth. And so having to really be mindful of what kind of data you put out there to protect their identity, all those kinds of things. But it is in part that, yeah, we often rely on like police records and things like that can be kind of sluggish to get to the rest of us. It's a good question.
Okay. The next one we have is, how can traffickers groom over internet? And we have a few people who also answered that. Someone said, honestly, grooming over the internet is the biggest thing for us right now, and the abuse happens by those same things they have already spoken about. Connecting with the victim and then forcing the child to send pictures or perform virtual sexual acts. One case, we had the trafficker connected and then threatened 2 teen girls if they didn't do certain things, he was going to hurt their friend. And somebody said that those were great points on the importance of language and how that can feed myths and victim culpability, including that child prostitution should not be used. Do you think that child pornography is a wrong term to use? My view is that it does not exist, and there is only abuse image of children.
That is a really great point. And I think we would agree, we consider all of those kinds of forms of child abuse CSEC. And so, CSEC can be videos, CSEC can be images, CSEC can be, the actual, physical exploitation, somebody being out on the street. That all falls under the umbrella of CSEC, because yeah, when we say things like child pornography or child prostitution, it does not reflect the true nature of what's happening to these survivors.
Thank you, Sydney. Are there any other questions? And while they're sending more questions, we would like to share with you our website, monarchsec.org, for additional information on our services, as well as upcoming events. We also have Instagram for Monarch County, which is more for adults. And then of course, we do have our Monarch for Youth. Please follow us. We often are posting and promoting the services, but also to ensure that youth are connected to Monarch in order to learn about these different topics. We also have our Facebook, Monarch Services, and we have a Twitter as well as a TikTok. With TikTok, we do activities as well as learning topics for youth. And of course, our YouTube channel, where all of our webinars that we have completed in the past couple of months are uploaded, and additionally other training services as well. And then we also have our blog. So please follow, like, and subscribe. It is important for our community to know that Monarch Services exist for the services. And please, if we're going to share our information, Maria and Sydney and Dahlia, if you have any additional questions, if you're interested in us doing a virtual presentation on any topic, we're more than happy to do so. As well as, again, if you know anyone who is a survivor, a victim or survivor of domestic violence, sexual violence, or human trafficking, CSEC, please refer them to the various agencies that they can speak to someone and seek services and, of course, support.
I see one question. Will we share the slides with people? So individually, you can definitely reach out to us to share the slides. We try to be mindful of just, like sharing the slides widely, because one of the things is we like to have the ability to answer and have context around some of the slides, and make sure that the appropriate information is getting out there, because we know that there's so much misinformation around trafficking and around CSEC. So if you are interested in the slides, or even better yet, if you're interested in us coming out to your agency and giving a presentation, feel free to email us with those emails that Maria had just put up. And I don't know if you want to share that again, just so people have a chance to like screenshot it or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, feel free to email and reach out to us, and we can definitely provide you with information and yeah, meet that request.
And I also want to point out that everyone who did participate, we do have Delphine who will be emailing information as well, and our contact information will definitely be there. So once again, this is our contact information, and I'm going to go to our crisis line. This is our crisis line. If you do come across anyone who is in need of services, once again, our crisis line is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, confidential. And of course free, and if anyone needs any confidential shelter, we are there to support them as well. And if we're not able to support, because I've read that some individuals are actually here joining us from England, welcome, that's amazing. We're more than happy to give them referrals for the area that they're calling from. And I want to read. Definitely. So I want to welcome everyone who are joining us from out of state, out of county. We did see that there's various states and here, and definitely someone from England who did say, and it is great to see, but also sad that we are facing the same issue, but the understanding and response are similar, as well as the commitment to tackle this. Definitely. I think it is important, especially right now during this pandemic, that as Sydney and some of you ask that question, right? We're not seeing some of the statistics, but is it happening? It's still happening, and we know that it's still happening, and that it hasn't stopped. The pandemic has not stopped. Unfortunately, the abuse has not stopped, the CSEC, and so it is important that we work together as a community, and even if, oh wow, Philippines, amazing, and that we are all here together. And this is just really brings to light the fact that the topic is so important, right? And seeing people from Oklahoma, Philippines, Scotland, wow. This is just New York, Georgia, UK, amazing. So I really want to appreciate you all being here. It really just, again, talks volumes about, you know, bringing communities together, right? To tackle this and human trafficking and support everyone, right? Boston, Connecticut, amazing. Wow. I want to appreciate again, everyone. We want to say thank you for joining us. And you're all always welcome in California once this pandemic is over. And Monarch Services is here available to do any Zoom virtual presentations for you if needed. So please reach out to us. Thank you.
This last question, or this other question, so if you have others, please feel free. But yes, this will be on our YouTube, and you can see other presentations we've done around domestic violence, dating violence in the time of